I'm going to try using this microphone. I find it very difficult to stand still behind a lectern. So anyway, I'd like to thank the organisers very much for giving me the opportunity to talk about this project, which is a many-person project, so it's certainly not mine. And I gave it a specific I gave the talk a specific topic because I wanted to really focus on this idea that there was a new way of teaching economics, teaching a first course in economics, that would take as one of its fundamental starting points ending the divide between micro and macro. So I wasn't going to come here and talk about macro, but I was going to come here and talk about this, trying to open up this question for discussion. So one way of figuring out what's on the minds of students when you begin teaching a course in economics to those students as they first arrive on campus is to ask them this question. And we've now asked them, classrooms full of students, this question all around the world. And this is what the answers look like. This is from the Universidad de los Andes in Bogota. The size of the word reflects the frequency with which students identify that issue. It's what they write down as the most pressing issue they think economists should be addressing. So it's pretty clear here that inequality is coming out very strongly. The same with sustainability. Questions about, if we look here again, this is students actually, UCL, you can see, this is a year ago. These students were very prescient already in September last year. They were worried about the challenges that Donald Trump was going to place before economists. So again, it's inequality. There are questions of green technology, immigration, global warming, climate change, automation, you can see here. If we look here at students at Humboldt, very similar kind of cluster of words, financial crises also appearing. They think we should be thinking about capitalism. This is more recently at the School of Business in Lisbon. Again, a similar set of topics. Here at Arkansas State University. And I had the chance to ask this question to a very different population. It would have been really quite interesting to do it here with all of you if I'd been given a few more minutes. But I asked the same question to the entire incoming cohort of graduate recruits at the Bank of England. And there were 98 of them. And I really didn't have any strong expectation of what I'd find when I took back to my office all the pieces of paper and went through them. And this is what those who decided on a career as professional economists in a central bank, they were also very exercised by the question of inequality. So I think that's quite remarkable, and it's kind of a challenge to all of us in terms of what we're teaching. The sorts of problems that were raised in those word clouds to do with inequality, instability, unemployment, fluctuations, the future of work, the mention of robots, automation, productivity crisis, questions of innovation and wealth creation, environmental problems. They're the kind of most frequently mentioned objects of concern. And these are the concepts new to an introductory course that match those themes and that we bring to center stage in the economy, the e-book and book that I'm talking about today. So these are a set of concepts that don't typically make their way into a first course in economics. So just starting here with rents, bargaining power, institutions, the dynamics of price setting, incomplete contracts, then Schumpeterian rents, disequilibrium, social interactions, non-self-regarding preferences. So if we take these concerns of the students, we think about the kinds of concepts that are going to be essential to develop the tools with which to address those questions, then we're really asking ourselves, what's the big idea? How are we going to pull together a way of teaching that takes these into account? So we could think of this kind of asking the question of what's the big organizing idea in Coase, the economy. And one way of posing that question is to try to write down the characteristics of the existing paradigm, which has been the basis of textbooks used in introductory courses in economics since Samuelson's Economics of 1948. And it can sort of be summarized, if you like, as Marshall plus Keynes. So it's got a particular view about people as being far-sighted and self-interested, about interactions, about the nature of information, contracts. Here, history is of rather limited importance. The economy is basically viewed as self-stabilizing. So to that was added Keynes, and what we are arguing, and you can read more about it in this piece in Vox that was published quite recently, is that we can, with using the best of contemporary economics, we can use that along with the insights of some other great 20th century economists. So in addition to Keynes, we need to broaden the scope of what constitutes the basic paradigm for teaching undergraduates. So who are the other two that enter the stage along with Keynes? They are John Nash, because we have to bring strategic interaction into play, and Friedrich Hayek, who obviously brought very much to the fore the role of scarce and local information. So this gives us a really very different right-hand column here to do with people, information, institutions, the role of history. You can see that it's obviously more complicated than the left-hand column. Okay, there are more words here. And if you read through them, you can see that not only people are self-interested, but they're also cognitively limited, and they have other motivations. We're not just focusing on price-taking markets. Price making, strategic interactions, the setting of wages, and so on is central. And here we have this kind of cluster of issues built out of the insights coming from Hayek and more recent work on information economics. Once you're moving outside this very narrow paradigm here, then history becomes extremely important to the teaching of the tools of economics. It's a source of understanding about the alternative rules of the game, with institutions playing a very central role. Then we are very interested in what's happened in history and about the process of change. Okay, so I'm not going to spend more time on this. I'm just giving it to you and you can go back and think about it afterwards, but to provide some kind of overarching way of understanding what I'm going to move on to now. And to connect the theme of the talk with this new paradigm, my argument is going to be that strategic interaction and limited information are central to understanding both micro and macro aspects of the economy. And I think it's quite striking that the text that the core team have put together is called The Economy. That's the object of study. It's not called economics. It's called The Economy. And I'm going to try and convince you of the importance of using these insights coming from Nash and Hayek, as well as from Keynes, to understand both these aspects and how they're related. We go about teaching economics in this text, The Economy, by starting with each of the units with a complex problem. And we move back from those problems to build the toolkit of economics. We focus on actors, so we stress game theory, Nash equilibrium, the importance of multiple equilibria, principal agent problems, price making, social preferences and norms, increasing returns, the role of positive feedbacks in bubble processes, for example, and of dynamics. So we end up with a very different kind of ordering, a very different sequencing of the first course. We teach game theory and social norms, institutions and firms before markets. So students don't see supply and demand curves in this way of coming to economics until the 8th week or the 8th unit. They've done an awful lot before they see a supply and demand curve. And I think what I want to persuade you of is that this provides the key foundations for understanding the aggregate economy. How does it do that? Well, because we begin with heterogeneous agents. We begin with actors in the economy who are in different positions. They're in positions as employee, employer, borrower, lender, owner, manager, government, central bank. So these are different actors that are in different positions and that are behaving in response to different kinds of incentives. So we have, we center the teaching around a set of principal agent problems, and what that does is that it leads very naturally to a model with involuntary unemployment and fluctuations, with endogenous money and bubbles, and where inequality, right, remember that great big fat word inequality that came out of all of those word clouds, where inequality is in the DNA of the modeling framework. So how do we do this? Begin with the idea of a principal agent problem. There are conflicts of interest between the two. This arises, these problems arise when there are information problems. So let's get concrete. This is what we're going to find throughout the economy in a whole number of settings. Those incomplete contracts, market failures are therefore ubiquitous. Institutions and social norms matter. So we take the first one that we talk about in the economy, which is in the labour market. And I can, as a footnote to this, I can say that in the labour market, students coming to economics through the economy never see supply and demand curves crossing in the labour market. So that's simply not a way of thinking about how the labour market works, because it centres around a principal agent problem between employer and employee. We begin with the question of what is the conflict of interest over the wage, the effort that the employer wants to get out of the worker would rather not supply. And what is left out of the contract? Well, the wage is in the contract, but the effort is not. When we think about this question of the relationships between workers and managers or employers and employees in the firm, then we get one of the features that we use in the book. We have lots of these features where we talk about when economists disagree. So there's loads and loads of when economists disagree. But this is when economists agree. And why it's kind of amusing for students is to see that there are two rather unlikely bedfellows in this, with a common view of the conflicts of interest in the firm, and that's Ronald Coase and Karl Marx. So it was Coase who said he defined the firm by its political structure. If a workman moves from Department Y to Department X, he doesn't go because of a change in prices, but because he's ordered to do so. So this is how we're building up the understanding of students about the economy, that object that they're trying to understand. This is the wage setting model. I'm not going to go through this in detail, but just to give you a kind of hint and hopefully kind of pique your curiosity so that you'll log on to the ebook and have a look for yourselves. So this is at the micro level where the firm is setting the wage. It's the interaction, that principal agent interaction between the employee and the employer. And we can see how this is effort here, this is the wage, how this function shifts with aggregate unemployment in the economy. When we start with a model like this, there has to be unemployment in equilibrium. There has to be a cost of job loss. Otherwise, it's impossible for the firm to get effort from the worker. So that's at the very center of the model. That allows us to build the wage setting curve, which is at the heart of the macroeconomic model, and then we bring data to the table by looking at an estimated wage setting curve with data from the US. But let's move on, right, swiftly to a second principal agent problem. So here we're talking about that between the borrower and the lender. You can see that this is set up in exactly the same way, so that we are helping students to develop a very systematic way of thinking about these two crucial markets, the labour market and the credit market. The outcome in the labour market was involuntary unemployment in equilibrium. In the credit market, it's credit rationing or credit constraints. Now, you only have to think for a moment to realise that this is giving you very powerful foundations for an understanding of how the aggregate economy operates. An explanation for structural unemployment and an explanation for demand-driven or cyclical unemployment. So here's another example. This is switching from structural to cyclical unemployment, the central role of aggregate demand. And here, the micro part of the story is the price-setting firm. So this is the macro model, and we're talking about stuck in a situation where there's some cyclical unemployment, thank you, and we're trying to think about what could happen to take us from B back towards X. Well, here's the model at the level of the firm. This is the price. This is the demand curve facing the firm. This is output. We can get back from B to X when we look at the level of the firm through a shift in aggregate demand. So that's using policies. That's, as it were, what Keynes had to say. And this is an alternative way of getting there, which is through flexibility of wages and prices. And that provides a very rich basis for discussion about why relying on this might really not be such a good idea, and why there's a case for using aggregate demand policies in a situation where you've got demand deficient or cyclical unemployment. Let's move swiftly on to inflation. Same model. We can ask the question many students are interested in: why is inflation falling? So we can think of explanations from stronger competition, weaker insiders, or something to do with those cycles, those fluctuations in demand. Let's take the same thing, right, that first case of stronger competition, figure out what the implications are for unemployment and for real wages. So we're going to get lower unemployment and higher real wages. And then we can use the Lorenz curve, so we can go straight to a representation of this outcome in a model of inequality. So we're able to really tightly link what's happening in the macroeconomy to what's happening to inequality. So students can actually calculate and draw the Lorenz curve and calculate the Gini coefficient before and after this shift in this increase in the intensity of product market competition. So here's two more actors. This is the government and the central bank. I'm running out of time, so I'm going to move through this very quickly. This is just to say that we're using a technique often used in micro to represent the objectives of the policymaker. You can read more about this on the core blog. So we're in quite an interesting open discussion about how we're modelling inflation. There's a third principal agent problem relating the central bank and the government to banks. This again shows you that we've got a very common structure across these different topics. What I'm going to do now, because I've run out of time, is to just flick through the slides to show you that we use a common modelling structure for a house price bubble and for an environmental problem. Students find this a very powerful insight. We use 100 years of economic history from the Great Depression to the Great Stagflation, from the Great Stagflation to the financial crisis. And the way you can access this material is through this free interactive ebook. There are 22 units. I did actually think that I could give this whole talk on this blue unit here, the global economy, because of the theme here of globalization. But I haven't even mentioned that once. But if you go through the ebook, you can look for all the blue spots in every unit, and you'll find where we treat aspects related to globalization. There are interactive slide lines. There are questions with answers. You can get a book. There's all these resources to help teachers reduce the costs of shifting. There'll soon be an app. Thank you very much.
So I can go fast here. These are the motivations for the book have already been presented by Wendy Carlin. It is the main purpose is to satisfy the very understandable wish of the students to be made to learn things that are immediately related to current problems and issues. And the educational approach taken in the book to respond to this need is to start always the discussion by presenting empirical material, historical or related to current problems, and then subsequently present the model and the theories that can help interpreting these problems and discussing them. This, of course, has a number of positive, result or positive effects, because the book presents a lot of empirical material, historical material, and so it's a very lively and informative textbook. It also contains, of course, here this reflects my own views, but according to my views, it also contains some interesting messages and statements. For example, that inflation reflects conflict over income distribution, the interest rate is set by the central bank, so it's not the result of demand and supply of savings, as is often maintained somehow in textbooks. There is no trade-off between equality and growth, quite the contrary, based on historical data. Institutions matter, adverse effects of globalization and technical change on labor can be very lasting. In the end, they will disappear, as in conventional wisdom, but they can last very long. This is also an interesting statement in the chapter on globalization, international trade, etc. A further feature was emerged very well from this position of before me, that is that there is widespread conflict of interest between different types of agents in the economy. Said that, in any case, my role here is to criticize, and I will do that. And I have a number of perplexities about this book, which I will summarize and then try to explain in more detail. But just before I do that, maybe I should state clearly what I regard as my priorities in the teaching of economics, so I make clear which is my standpoint and the standpoint from which I look at the book. I think that our major aim in teaching economics should be to teach students to think in a rigorous and critical way about economic problems. And in order to do so, I think it is very important that students learn that there are different economic theories, and that they learn to understand very well what are the assumptions and the logical steps which make, of which these different approaches are made, are constructed, and so that they can be able to compare these different approaches on different grounds, on various grounds, that is on realism of assumption, on internal consistency of the approaches, and also, of course, by checking their predictions and conclusions in comparing with the empirical evidence, by using empirical evidence. Of course, an undergraduate students cannot do all that. Many of us cannot do all of that quite well about any, every topic. But they can be trained to do so. That is, they can be trained to look at different approaches, to ask themselves questions about the logical steps, the assumptions, the consistency with facts, and so on. Also, this, I think I can go faster on that. I'm not quite convinced that the problem with mainstream teaching and mainstream textbook is that they do not deal with real-world problems. Especially for macroeconomic textbook, there is plenty of data and current problems in those books written by Blanchard or Mankiw or whatever. The point is that very often we don't like the interpretations or the explanations they give to these problems, and they don't like them because we think that they are not very consistent with facts and so on. So I'm not sure that the problem is really of course, we have to teach things that are related to current problem, but I'm not sure that this is not done by mainstream economics. Mainstream economics has plenty of answers to the question about why there is unemployment, why there is inequality, etc. The problem is that the answers are different from what we think is relevant. So, said that, I think these are my fundamental criticism to the book, and which I will then try to explain. And I think that, in fact, taken on the whole, of course, it's a big book and contains a lot of things, a lot of topics are treated. But I think on the whole, what the book presents is a New Keynesian textbook in micro and macro, so imperfect competition, etc., and the usual macroeconomic conclusion of the New Keynesian approach. I think it's not really presenting or even, not even given a hint in many cases that there are different approaches to the same problem. And the other thing I think is not convincing is that this is a problem not just with this book. I think it's a very widespread problem with the mainstream textbooks as well, or current textbook anyway, that theories are presented as facts. That is to say, things, ideas, notions, decreasing demand curves and all that are in fact the result of very complex theoretical constructs that have been built in time by several authors, etc., are very quickly presented as if they were facts that can be normally observed, maybe providing some empirical support to these supposed observed facts, but it's not explained what is the analytical source and the assumptions, and also the ceteris paribus assumption and so on, which are behind such constructs. And I think this is a very bad for developing critical and rigorous thinking. So now I'm trying to go faster. Why I think it's New Keynesian and mainstream in many ways. I include, of course, the New Keynesian in the mainstream. Not everybody does, so it's, again, my personal view. I think because in the end, you have decreasing demand functions for products, you have a production function, and most of all, you have a tendency to the narrow, always. On top of course, this is intertwined with assumptions of imperfect competition, wages as incentives, incomplete markets and contracts, effective demand is relevant in the short run, etc. So we have doses of realism and flexibility in the analysis for the short run, but in the long run, in fact, the economy tends always to equilibrium unemployment. the equilibrium unemployment as it results from standard New Keynesian models. Growth is entirely supply determined. Institutions matter for growth, but they matter as they affect the supply side of the economy, so as they keep down the wage curve, that is wage demands, as they stimulate private investment and productivity growth, as they favor the matching of unemployment and jobs. But there is no role of institutions or favoring development and growth by, I don't know, import substitution, stimulating demand and things like that. So there is no mention that there exists in the, among different interpretations of development and growth, one interpretation that sees that external demand is very important for capitalist development, a notion that goes back to a Marxist tradition, then also Kaleski, Kaldor, and so on and so forth, till recent times, and that there can be demand-led growth. There is no hint that there can be a view of aggregate investment as depending itself on aggregate demand development over time, so that aggregate demand can stimulate capacity creation in the long run. And also, I'm not completely clear, as we talk about GDP in the long run, what exactly is the theory of accumulation, the theory of investment in the book. It seems to be a theory based on the ordering of projects, so internal rate of return compared to the interest rate, but in some parts of the book, then the emphasis is more on the state of confidence and so on, rather than the interest rate. So it's a bit, I'm not sure that it becomes clear for the students what exactly determines the investment according to the book. Another, now an example or some example, I don't know how much time I have, you will tell me. There are some instances in which I think theory is presented as a fact. This, for example, is the basis is an empirical support provided for the fact that the demand curve for a product is, there is a decreasing relation between price and quantity. So it's a demand curve for a product. But this is of course, the demand curve for a particular type of cereal. So it's the demand curve for an slightly differentiated product, while the price of other products, similar products, other cereals, so to speak, is kept constant. So it's just showing how competition works at the micro level when there is product differentiation. But then it seems to me, maybe I've missed something in reading the book, that this is becomes a bit confused with the decreasing demand schedule for a standardized good or a class of goods as a whole, which of course is a completely different basis and was constructed in neoclassical theory on the analysis of utility, preferences, and so on and so forth, which I don't think is there. So that, again, one misses the opportunity to present a theory and also to present the possible critical points in this theory. And then this decreasing demand curve actually plays quite an important role in the book, because a lot of things end up resting on the elasticity of this curve. It is the elasticity of this curve for the slightly differentiated product that determines the markup in that industry at the micro level, partial equilibrium level. But then this markup becomes relevant or becomes the markup for the economy as a whole. And the markup for the economy as a whole, of course, explains the aggregate income shares. It also, given a certain set of institutions, explains equilibrium, employment, unemployment, and explains inflation when wage pressures are such as to as to become inconsistent with the given markup. So a lot of things seem to be based on the elasticity of this little curve, and I'm wondering whether this is really enough as a foundation for all these macroeconomic conclusions. And even the tendency for employment to increase when nominal wage falls seems to be based at that point on this partial equilibrium analysis rather than on aggregate demand analysis. Another point on which I think theory, very complex theory, and is presented as a fact is when it is explained, when there is an explanation of the production function and the decreasing productivity of capital. And here the explanation is that there is a limit to the number of machines a worker can make use of, as shown by Charlie Chaplin in a famous film. So this is not enough, I think, for something that has been, as we all know, the object of a very, very, let's say, analytical, profound, strong controversy. Also, it does not explain that this change in the capital-labor ratio in traditional theory, neoclassical theory, was thought of. I'm talking of movements along one production function, as a change not only of the proportion of labor to capital, but also as a change in the techniques in use and also therefore in the forms of the machines. Okay, so it gives a very strange, let's say, representation of the problem. And of course, if you change machine, then the point becomes, how do you know that something is more capital or less capital than something else? 5 minutes? Okay. And also, of course, there is a natural question. Why should capital be increased while the quantity of labor is kept constant? Why should one do such a stupid thing as not increase the number of workers together with the number of machines? And of course, the reason is that there is some assumption about the scarcity of labor in the economy as a whole, but this should perhaps be explored a little more, because there may be many reasons to think that the labor is not really scarce for a number of reasons. There are endogeneities, there is unemployment, and so on. Another thing is that it is true that there are little boxes where it is told how economists disagree about things in economics, but most often they disagree according to the book about empirical matters. One example is the size of the multiplier, but very seldom they disagree on theoretical questions. Another point which I think is not really clear on the on analytical grounds is what exactly is the theory of primary income distribution. I've said that the markup is taken from the partial equilibrium level and then translated at the macro level. But if one student asked what exactly determines the markup and the profit rate in this economy, why are we assuming that if there is an improved bargaining strength of the workers for institutional reasons or because unemployment falls, why can't this possibly reduce the profit rate of the markup? Why is that given in real terms? Why, therefore, do we need to have this result, which is not very consistent with facts, that every time we want to increase employment and decrease unemployment, we have not inflation, but accelerating inflation? This is not very consistent with the evidence. And in the end, it rests upon this idea that you cannot alter income distribution. But what is exactly, why not? What determines the profit rate? Actually, from what you say what is said in the monetary theory part, that the interest rate is set by the central bank, so it's an institutional outcome, a policy outcome, would you be ready to say that then the profit rate is also determined by the central bank, because interest rate and profit rate in the long run have to be equal? So, I mean, there are open issues, open questions on this front, which are not, I think, too clearly explain, although of course they're very relevant for the inequality issue, which is so topical, so actual. And I think there are, just to conclude quickly, there could be ways. I'm not saying that in the book one should present 10th theory, because it's already very big, this book, without that. But I think that there could be hints at some crucial points that there are different views among economists. And this might be, I think, could be explained in a way which is not too difficult for an undergraduate student. In particular, I think there are 2 points which are a focus of the points from which many, then differences can derive concerning the analysis of the economy. And the first one is the investment theory. One could say I'm finished. One could say it's the interest rate, but other people say it's aggregate demand, in fact. And if it is aggregate demand, then this may lead people to think then that there is a long-run effect of changes in aggregate demand, on accumulation, and so on, or productivity, and so on. The second very crucial point I think is a theory of distribution, what determines the profit rate and the markup in the aggregate. I think, again, here, explaining that there are different views. Some people may think that it's just a matter of bargaining power both sides. So changes in institution can cause a decrease in the profit rate with no so serious consequences for the economy, but with a number of consequences for the analysis of the Phillips curve and so on. So thank you for your attention. This was my discussion.